The morning sun bathed Willow Creek in a golden glow, its rays slicing through the mist that clung to the cobblestone streets. The town square bustled with its usual charm, vendors setting up their stalls, children chasing each other with carefree laughter, and the faint melody of a violinist playing for spare change. Yet, something felt off. Ellie Harper leaned against the weathered brick wall of the Willow Gazette, her notebook cradled in one hand and a lukewarm coffee in the other. She scribbled down notes, her sharp eyes darting across the square. The stories had started pouring in last week, unexplained fevers, discolored skin, and bizarre aggression. Nothing confirmed, of course, but Ellie thrived on the whispers of what others dismissed. "Ellie, you're chasing ghosts again." The familiar voice of her editor, Martin Hale, snapped her out of her thoughts. He stood at the doorway of the office, his tie loosened and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "Small towns don't get pandemics, kid. Stick to pumpkin festivals and bake sales." Ellie offered a tight-lipped smile. "Tell that to Mrs. Carmichael. She swears her neighbor tried to eat his dog." Martin snorted. "She's half blind and drinks her dinner. Don't waste your time." But Ellie couldn't shake the unease. The reports were too similar, too chilling to ignore. She decided to visit Dr. Collins later that afternoon. If anyone could make sense of this madness, it was the town's resident mad scientist. Later that day, the narrow path to Dr. Collins' house was overgrown, the branches of ancient oaks twisting together like skeletal fingers. The house itself was a crumbling Victorian relic, its windows dark and uninviting. Ellie hesitated at the gate before summoning her courage and knocking. The door creaked open, revealing Drive Collins in his signature disheveled state, wild hair, glasses smudged, and a lab coat stained with something ominously red. "Ms. Harper," he said, his voice gravelly. "You shouldn't be here. People are getting sick, doctor. I need to know what's going on." Collins sighed, motioning her inside. "You won't like the answer." Inside, the air smelled of chemicals and mildew. Papers and vials cluttered every surface, diagrams pinned to the walls. Collins handed Ellie a file, his expression grim. "These cases, fever, aggression, decay, they're not normal. It's not a virus. It's something else. A mistake." "What kind of mistake?" Ellie pressed. Collins hesitated, then shook his head. "You need to leave it alone. For your own safety." The scream pierced the air like a knife, shattering the quiet afternoon. Ellie bolted toward the source, her heart pounding. In the center of the square, a man staggered, his body convulsing. His skin was gray, peeling in patches, and his eyes were bloodshot and glassy. "Help him," someone shouted, but before anyone could move, the man lunged at a bystander, sinking his teeth into the woman's neck. Blood sprayed, painting the cobblestones red. The crowd erupted in panic, scattering in all directions. Ellie froze, her instincts warring between running and documenting the chaos. The bitten woman collapsed, convulsing violently. Ellie's breath hitched as the woman's eyes snapped open, now clouded and lifeless. She rose to her feet with an unnatural jerk, her head swiveling toward the nearest person. Within minutes, the infection spread like wildfire. Ellie crouched behind a parked car, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. She recorded the scene, her voice barely a whisper. "This is Ellie Harper. Willow Creek is under attack by something unimaginable." A guttural growl made her whip around. One of the infected had spotted her, its hollow eyes locking onto her. It let out a shriek and charged, its decayed limbs moving faster than they should have. Ellie screamed, her phone slipping from her hand as she bolted, the sound of pounding footsteps growing louder behind her. Ellie narrowly escapes the infected by darting into a nearby alley. The tension rises as she must navigate the dark, labyrinthine backstreets of the town while avoiding both the infected and panicked townsfolk. Ellie's boots pounded against the pavement as she sprinted down the main street, her lungs burning. The guttural snarls of the infected man grew louder, too close for comfort. "Think, Ellie, think," she whispered to herself, adrenaline surging. Ahead, the street opened into an alleyway framed by tall brick buildings. Without hesitating, Ellie veered into it, her shoulders slamming into the corner as she turned. The narrow passage reeked of garbage and dampness, the stench making her gag. Behind her, the infected howled, its voice echoing off the walls. It wasn't slowing down. Ellie's eyes darted around the dim alley, searching for a weapon, a hiding spot, anything. Her gaze landed on a rusted metal dumpster pushed against the wall. She dashed toward it and scrambled behind, pressing herself against the cold metal. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts, and she clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle the sound. The infected man staggered into the alley seconds later, his movements jerky and unnatural. He paused, his head tilting like a predator sniffing out its prey. His chest heaved, his nostrils flaring as he let out a low growl. Ellie's heart thundered in her chest. She could feel every beat, loud and insistent, as if it might give her away. She dared not move, barely even breathing. The infected man stumbled closer, his rotting face illuminated briefly by the flickering light of a nearby lamppost. His lips were pulled back in a grotesque snarl, revealing jagged, blood-stained teeth. Ellie reached for a broken pipe lying beside her, her fingers trembling as they closed around the cold metal. She braced herself, waiting for the inevitable. The infected sniffed the air again, then let out a frustrated shriek. It slammed its fists against the dumpster, the metallic clang reverberating through the alley. Ellie flinched, biting her lip to stifle a scream. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the tension, a piercing car alarm from the next street over. The infected froze, its head snapping toward the noise. With a guttural snarl, it turned and sprinted toward the sound, its footsteps fading into the distance. Ellie exhaled sharply, her body sagging against the dumpster. The pipe slipped from her grasp, clattering to the ground. She covered her face with her hands, fighting back tears. "What the hell is happening?" she whispered. After a moment, she forced herself to move. Staying still wasn't an option anymore. She peeked out from behind the dumpster, scanning the alley for any other threats. When she was certain it was clear, she stepped out, her legs trembling beneath her. As Ellie makes her way out of the alley, she stumbles upon another survivor, a young man named Sam, who is barricading himself in a nearby hardware store. Sam reluctantly lets Ellie inside, and the two share information about what they've seen. Ellie learns that attacks like this are happening all over town, and the hardware store becomes a temporary safe spot. The hardware store was quiet, too quiet. Ellie paced the dimly lit aisles, her eyes darting toward the barricaded entrance. Sam, the young man she'd met moments earlier, was frantically hammering planks of wood over a broken window. "They'll get through," Ellie warned, clutching a wrench she'd grabbed as an impromptu weapon. Sam shot her a nervous glance. "We don't have much of a choice, do we?" Before Ellie could respond, a loud crash echoed through the store. The barricade shuddered under the force of dozens of fists pounding against it. The infected had found them. "Ellie, grab something heavy," Sam shouted. Ellie didn't hesitate. She dragged a metal shelf across the floor, adding it to the barricade just as the door buckled inward. Hands, gray, rotting, and claw-like, pushed through the gap, followed by snarling faces. "Run," Sam yelled, pulling Ellie toward the back exit. They bolted through the narrow stockroom, the sound of splintering wood and shuffling feet growing louder behind them. As they reached the back door, Sam turned, pushing Ellie through first. "Go, I'll hold them off." "No, you'll." The infected burst through before Ellie could finish. Sam shoved her forward, slamming the door shut behind her. His screams were the last thing she heard as she stumbled into the cold night. Ellie didn't stop running until the glow of the hospital came into view. Its emergency entrance was a scene of utter pandemonium. Ambulances crowded the driveway, and people screamed and shoved as they tried to force their way inside. Ellie pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding. Inside, the hospital was no better. Doctors and nurses rushed from room to room, their faces pale with fear. Patients writhed on stretchers, their skin gray and blistered. "Help us," a woman screamed, clutching the hand of a man who had begun convulsing violently. Ellie's stomach churned as the man's body went still. His eyes snapped open moments later, clouded and dead. He lunged at the woman, biting into her neck as she screamed. "Get down!" The shout came from behind her. Ellie turned just in time to see a man in combat gear, his face streaked with dirt, raising a crowbar. He swung it with precision, crushing the infected man's skull. Blood splattered across the linoleum floor. The man turned to Ellie, his piercing blue eyes scanning her quickly. "You bit." Ellie shook her head, too stunned to speak. "Good. Stay close if you want to live." The man introduced himself as Jake, a former soldier who had been at the hospital visiting his mother when the outbreak began. His survival instincts had kicked in fast. He'd fortified one wing of the hospital and gathered supplies. "I don't usually take on strays," Jake muttered as he handed Ellie a makeshift weapon. "But you don't look like you'll last 5 minutes without help." Ellie bristled but kept quiet. She followed Jake through the chaotic corridors, the sounds of snarling and screaming echoing around them. "What the hell is happening?" Ellie finally asked. Jake glanced at her, his jaw tight. "Looks like the end of the world to me."